All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to KJZZ's latest conversation about one of the biggest issues facing Arizona, that, of course, being water. Tonight's discussion is part of our commitment to covering this issue, reporting on this issue. It's part of our ongoing water series called Every Last Drop. This is the second in our series of panel discussions. I'm Mark Brody, co-host of KJZZ's The Show. I'll be your moderator for this evening. We'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsor for tonight, the Walton Family Foundation. I would also very much like to introduce our distinguished panel to you. Starting here with Kathleen Ferris, Senior Research Fellow at the Kyl Center for Water Policy in ASU's Morrison Institute for Public Policy, also a former director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. Sure, absolutely. Next to her is Troy Hayes, Phoenix's Water Services Director, held that job since 2021. And Holly Irwin, Chair of the La Paz County Board of Supervisors in Western Arizona, serving her fourth term. So just a quick word about how tonight's conversation will go. Many of you submitted questions, both those of you in the room and those of you online. Thank you for watching. Hello. We'll try to sprinkle in as many of those as we can throughout the evening. Also, for those of you here with us in the room, you might have noticed note cards when you walked in and pencils. If you have a question as the evening goes along, feel free to jot it down. Just raise it in your hand. Jill Ryan, my colleague here, will stop by to collect them. If you need a note card, if something comes in your head and you don't have a note card and you'd like one, similarly, raise your hand. Jill will bring you what you need and you can jot down your question. Lastly, please make sure your cell phones are on vibrate or airplane mode or some mode where they won't ring an embarrassing ringtone when somebody calls or texts. So, we're talking tonight mainly about groundwater, which is one of the sources of water that we have in the state. But I want to sort of start by defining our terms here. And Kathy, I'll start with you for the sort of statewide perspective. When we're talking about groundwater, what exactly are we talking about?
We are talking about water that is stored underground and has been stored there over the Ice Age.
Long time.
7,000 to 8,000 years old, and it's finite. Once it's pumped, it's gone.
How much of it do we have?
We don't know for sure. The Department of Water Resources is continually doing studies about it, but we do know that we have been mining that groundwater for decades, meaning we are taking far more out than is replenished.
And in terms of the overall water portfolio in the state, Kathy, like where does that fit in with, for example, the Colorado River, the Salt and Verde rivers, other sources of water that we have?
So groundwater makes up 40% of the state's water supplies. Colorado River water is another about 40%. No, it's about 36, I think. And in-state streams, rivers and streams such as the Salt River make up about 21%. And then another 3% comes from reclaimed water, which is basically wastewater that has been treated in a sanitary, collected in a sanitary sewer and treated.
And Troy, this is something that the city of Phoenix is talking about doing more of. I want to get to that in a minute, but and don't look so surprised. Yeah. But so you have, I've read where you have referred to groundwater, sort of the resource of last resort for the city of Phoenix. What do you mean by that?
So when they enacted the Groundwater Management Act in 1980, essentially Phoenix took that to heart and started to convert its resources to renewable surface water. And so 98 to 99% of the water that we produce on every year comes from renewable sources. So either from the Salt and the Verde or from the Colorado River system. Only about 1 or 2% of our supplies are groundwater. And so we store those and we recharge our excess surface water to ensure that we build those credits for the future. Because as Kathy said, is once you pump those, it's very difficult to get that back, if ever.
Does Phoenix, do you use your groundwater right now, or do you really just try to keep it underground and sort of save it for, pardon the pun, a rainy day?
Yeah, it's really saved for the part of the rainy day in the sense of we pump our wells because we have to, regulatory wise, we have to move them. We have to make sure that they still work. And that's about the type of well capacity that we're talking about. During the drought, we are expanding our well capacity because there's times in the future in which we might have to go pull those. And so we have that. We also have agreements with the Salt River Project to utilize their wells, and as well as our unique agreement with the city of Tucson, where we store some of our surface water down in Tucson to use their wells to be able to pull that in exchange for surface water. So for the most part, the city of Phoenix is built to utilize surface water from the Salton, the Verde, or the Colorado.
Holly, how about in your part of the state? Obviously, a more rural area than here in Phoenix. What role does groundwater play for you and your constituents?
Groundwater is everything for our constituents. You know, those that are in the rural areas, you know, they depend solely on groundwater. And pretty much that's it. You know, the ones that are on the outskirts rely on the Colorado River, you know, for their water supply. But for the most part, the eastern portion of La Paz County is all relying on the groundwater.
And what is the situation in La Paz County? Like how much do you have? Do you know?
You know what? I would love to know. I've been asking that question since 2015.
Wow.
Specifically on one basin with, you know, absolutely no response or no answers or any action. And here we are in 2023 and I have no idea.
So what is that like? I mean, as you say, it's everything. Your residents rely on this, but you really don't have a sense of how much there is.
Right. And it's very frustrating. You know, we're a very rural county. The last one formed in the state in 1983. And, you know, we're unique because we have basins that are in La Paz County that are unrestricted. So it's very frustrating because you can just basically, anybody can put it, what we refer to as just a straw on the ground, and there's no restrictions. So the pumping is enormous. And, you know, and it's really starting to affect the residents and the constituents that I represent. And it's very heartbreaking when they come to you asking you for help. And I go to the state only to, you know, have our concerns and our, you know, the help that the residents need just fall on deaf ears. And it's not from our local representatives that are down at the legislature. It's just hard to get any legislation passed, period.
So Kathy, let's talk about legislation. You were part of the Groundwater Management Act of 1980 that Troy mentioned. This, among many other things, I mean, this was a huge piece of legislation, but set up what's called active management areas, AMAs. That's an acronym that we'll probably use a few times tonight. There are 5 of them across the state: Phoenix, Tucson, I think Prescott, and Pinal
Santa
County,
Cruz.
Santa Cruz, yes.
And now the Douglas AMA.
Right, the Douglas AMA that just came in because of a vote last year. So what was the thinking in terms of putting some of the more metropolitan areas of the state under these AMAs, which have regulations and restrictions on groundwater pumping, but not other parts of the state?
Political thinking. So what happened was we set out to draft a comprehensive law for the entire state. But we got to the point where there wasn't agreement on what that law should contain. And in order to get that agreement, we had to focus on the areas that were going to get Central Arizona Project water. And in fact, the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Cecil Andrus, came to town and said, if you don't pass a Groundwater Management Act by June of 1980, then you're not going to have the Central Arizona Project. So it was political expediency, really, focusing on the most populated areas and the areas that would get CAP water.
So looking at that law now, 40 plus years after the fact, what in your mind works in it and what doesn't work?
Oh, that's a tough question, Mark, because the act was revolutionary at the time. And I think it has accomplished a lot. One of the most important things it did was to stop the expansion of irrigated agriculture in the active management areas. Now, why is that important? It's important because agriculture at the time was using 90% of the water. And we knew we couldn't expand that agriculture and have a healthy economy. The other thing that I thought was most important was the assured water supply requirement. And this is a requirement that says if you're going to develop a subdivision, you have to prove to the Department of Water Resources in advance that you have a 100-year assured water supply for that subdivision. Now, that isn't working as well as it should. And the reason is the legislature came in 1993 and amended the law to allow developers and subdividers to use groundwater as an assured water supply if another state entity would replenish that groundwater later. Years later now, that is the primary mechanism for subdivision growth, and we know that it is unsustainable.
Holly, in La Paz County, when you say that groundwater really is sort of the main source, are you seeing, I assume there's a lot of agriculture. We know there's a lot of agriculture there. Is the groundwater situation also affecting development, either residential, commercial, industrial, any of that?
It's, right now it's affecting the residents that currently are there. The agricultural, certain agricultural companies are having an effect with the amount of groundwater that's coming out. We've seen cattle ranchers lose their wells. We've seen churches be without water. Residents that are losing their wells, whether they've been there for generations or those that have moved out to the area to retire, not anticipating the fact in 2 and 3 years, they're going to have to dig their well deeper because the amount of water depth has fallen. And, and that can cost anywhere from $25,000 to $35,000 to replace their well. So when you have people moving out there to relocate to enjoy their latter part of their life, and that's the last thing that they want to have to worry about is digging another well because it's going dry.
Right.
And a lot of it is affected by some of the massive pumping that's going around in the area.
So, Holly, we have a question from the audience asking, what kind of help are La Paz County residents requesting that they're not able to get?
They want metering. They want anything that they can get, on the basins. They want to know how much water we have, what the quality of water is. They're asking for some sort of help, when they continue to see the Department of Water Resources continue to issue water permits for these commercial wells. They're wondering, hey, look, we've been saying that we're having issues. It's been all over the place. I've delivered 500 signatures from my constituents, to the governor, previous governor, begging for help and only to have nothing happen. So it's been a very difficult thing for them, to try to, get some sort of help on there, with what they're dealing with on a daily basis in real time.
Troy, how has the AMA requirement in terms of a 100-year assured water supply and some of the restrictions on groundwater, how has that affected the way that the city of Phoenix uses its water and thinks about water in terms of development?
Yeah, as I said, I think for a lot of the time that there's been an act that we have changed how we use water and how we think about water for the future. During that time, like I said, we've moved away from groundwater. We've gone to renewable surface water. We utilize that analysis, whether we're adding a home or an industry. That all goes into our annual demands, and we have to account for that in our planning. And so sometimes there are trade-offs. When you add this industry or that industry, are you going to then give up, the amount of homes that you can have? Or do you have to then go out and secure additional water resources or additional supplies to help back that up? And that's really what's forced the city of Phoenix to develop a very diverse, very robust water portfolio that we have, the great pleasure of utilizing today. And if we didn't, we would be in a very serious consequences related to the Colorado River if they didn't have those additional resources and all that to back it up, if they wouldn't have done that planning.
Kathy, in terms of figuring out the 100-year assured water supply, how do people actually do that? Especially because, as you said, we don't really know how much groundwater there is.
So it's much more complicated now that we're dealing with groundwater, but it's also complicated because we are seeing drier conditions on the Colorado River and our surface water supplies. So what we used to think would be physically available now and in the future, those projections are wrong, basically. And the problem with groundwater is we can't see it, of course. And so the department does hydrological modeling using computer stimulation to figure out what they think the water supply is underground. And unfortunately, what we're finding is that as the ability to do that analysis gets more sophisticated, the Department of Water Resources is finding that there's less groundwater than they previously thought in many of the groundwater basins in the active management areas, and that they have in fact over allocated that groundwater to certificates of assured water supply, which is what a developer has to get.
And these are developments that have already are either up or have already been approved, like you can't sort of pull them back.
No, that's one of the problems. Once you get a certificate, it's gold. And unless you change the footprint of the subdivision, the department has very little authority to revoke that certificate.
I have to say, that sounds mildly terrifying.
Well, welcome to my world. I absolutely agree. And you know, I want to make a point about what Troy is saying, because one of the best things about the assured water supply requirement is that the Department of Water Resources must designate cities and towns and private water companies that have an assured water supply. And that assured water supply requirement, as Troy noted, applies to everything the city or town serves, not just subdivisions, but schools and hospitals and golf courses and parks and industries. It's the gold standard for an assured water supply. Plus, the department has to review that every 15 years based on newer studies and newer data. So it's a rolling, it's not a permanent assured water supply. And that is really probably the best aspect of the assured water supply requirements.
Holly, Cochise County last year in the 2022 elections, Kathy referenced it. Voters there approved a new active management area in one basin, rejected it in another. Mm-hmm. Is that something that would be a possibility in La Paz County to set yourself up as an active management area?
Being that it deals with the 100-year water supply, I don't think that would work for La Paz County. An INA, irrigation non-expansion area, would be something that would more suit our county. And I know that we've, myself, along with other supervisors from Mojave and some other counties, Yavapai, have been working on some legislation. Leah Biasucci has been working on it. And the unfortunate thing, and it goes back to my previous comment about the frustration with down at the legislature, we can't even get bills heard in committees, which is horrid. And, you know, and I apologize for being so passionate about this, but we've been working, Regina Cobb, our previous representative, tried to run legislation only to have it stonewalled. You know, we cannot seem to get anything past the legislature. And so, you know, we're at a point right now where it's up to the governor to step in and do something, because we can't keep kicking this can down the road for rural Arizona and just, you know, continue to do practices as they've been going on. You know, at some point they're going to have to embrace change, or we're going to be in real trouble. I mean, we already are seeing the effects from not having any restrictions, where we were left out at the time when the Groundwater Act was enacted. You know, we were left without restrictions, and they knew they were going to have to go back at some point and fix that. Well, it hasn't been done, and now we're seeing the effects of it 40 years plus down the road.
Well, you mentioned the efforts of the legislature. In fact, when we had the first panel, then Representative Cobb was on that panel and talked about how she had been running legislation for several years to try to expand active management areas across the state. What are you hearing, or what do you hear from lawmakers about why it's not happening?
I don't think I can say that on the air. You know, they're frustrated too, you know, and it's very unfortunate that, you know, we just can't seem to. Rural Arizona has a right to develop, just like Phoenix, no offense, and Tucson and whatnot, instead of being looked at now as the sacrificial lamb, so they can continue to develop down here in the metropolitan areas. You know, we have developments, we have projects, we have everything up and down the river, whether it's going to be surface water or groundwater. There needs to be some sort of regulation for rural Arizona. We need to protect that for everybody to be able to exist.
Troy, we talked a little bit about how some of the earlier estimates and projections of how much groundwater there is have turned out to maybe be a little over optimistic. Understanding that you run the Water Services Department, not the Economic Development Department for the city of Phoenix, I'm wondering, like, what thoughts go through your mind when you look at some of those projections of, projects that have been approved or that are up already that have been said that they have a 100-year assured water supply, and maybe in reality they don't.
So I would say in the city of Phoenix, we still believe that they do, in the sense of what we believe is once we take a customer, that's our customer for its life. And that is a very difficult thing in the desert, right? When you have a city or a town or something that's in the desert that has arid climate, that's not necessarily getting cooler and it's not necessarily getting any wetter. And to be able to have a water supply for those homes and businesses forever and ever is a difficult task, which is why when we get into areas like this, when the city of Phoenix gets into areas where we're stressed, we then to look to add more to the portfolio, to add more buffers, to add more assurity to that. And that's one of the most challenging things with the Colorado River is what we have is just what are the rules? And in the end, what is the cuts going to be so that we could plan around that? It's trying to plan from having none to having the full allocation, which gets difficult of how many scenarios can we run. But at the end of the day, we're not resting on the portfolio that we have. We're trying to add more, trying to add different ones, which then goes back to looking at wastewater and putting that back to beneficial use as well. Because that is a supply that right now is discharged to the Salt River, which potentially could be sent to an advanced water purification facility to be treated and eventually put back in as drinking water.
So Kathy, does all of this mean that cities and towns and counties maybe need to think outside the box, be a little more creative about where they're getting their 100-year assured water supply if groundwater isn't maybe what we thought it was years ago? In the Colorado River, we all know that, that is over allocated. Or do things like wastewater treatment and maybe desalination become more important to meet those requirements?
So I am a big fan of the city of Phoenix and what the city of Phoenix has done over the last many decades. And they're very lucky because they have Salt and Verde River water. And that is a hugely important resource that isn't available to outside of this valley. And a lot of the other cities have that too. But as these sources get more stressed, everybody's going to look more and more to groundwater. And I am terribly concerned about that. I think that is not a good way to go. So I applaud the effort to reuse wastewater. It is going to take billions of dollars for the city of Phoenix and other cities to do this. They're going to have to get over what everybody says is the yuck factor. They're going to have to really do a lot of marketing and good work, good solid work, but I'm sure they will. And that is a very creative solution. I am not a big fan of desal at the moment because nobody has yet come up with a plan that seems to me to be economically and environmentally feasible. Will it be down the road? Maybe, but it is not going to be a panacea. It is not going to be a panacea. So the kinds of things that people are going to have to do, we're going to have to rethink how we use water. We're going to have adaptation measures. We're going to have to control how we grow and where we grow. The Bureau of Reclamation did a study recently that showed that the most economic way to increase the water supply is to slow the outward growth and not to leapfrog and build and require the infrastructure that and resources that we'll need.
So we've been talking about the 100-year assured water supply, and I want to go to a question that somebody had submitted ahead of time, which is basically, so when that provision was put into place, what was the thinking about what would happen in year 101?
Isn't that a remarkable? Let me tell you, I ask that question now all the time because it's been like 40 years.
Yeah, we're getting closer.
43 years. But at the time, you have to remember how revolutionary this idea was. Revolutionary that we were going to require a 100-year water supply before we would allow a new development. And it almost didn't get enacted. It was the very last thing that was agreed upon. So yeah, now we go, okay, we're 40 years in. What are we going to do after the next 60? Good question.
So we don't really know.
We don't really know. If you have renewable water, that's why it's so important to grow on renewable water supplies, because the idea is that they will renew themselves, surface water supplies, and that you won't run out after 100 years. But groundwater, who knows?
So Holly, I want to ask you about something that has been in the news quite a bit recently, which is
Wonderful.
foreign, yeah, I'll give you 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count. Foreign companies
Yes.
who have farmland
Right.
in your county, using
Right.
it to grow crops, mostly alfalfa. In the
Yes.
case that we're talking about now, a Saudi Arabian
Correct.
firm growing alfalfa, shipping it back
Yes,
to Saudi Arabia. Attorney General Chris Mays revoked some drill permits.
right.
Sounds like you're not too upset about that.
Oh, not at all. I mean, it's a shame that we're dealing with that. But again, it goes back to the fact that we have a county that has basins that are unrestricted. Okay, so, and just to educate those that are either online or those in the audience, this particular company, not only are they leasing state land in one basin, they own property in another basin. So you have the foreign companies that are here in 2 of our basins that are unrestricted, using our natural resources to grow hay to send back to a country that has depleted theirs. So yeah, it's a little upsetting.
What kind of reaction do these arrangements have? I mean, we're obviously here, not in La Paz County. So
Right.
what's the chatter in your community about this?
I think it's one thing, they embrace the farming community, and I want to put this out there, it's, I'm not portraying that it's, I'm completely against farming. They're more upset with the foreign company being here. The fact that we're seeing effects from massive pumping with these permits that have been issued, by ADWR over the last several years with no stoppage, knowing that there is issues happening in La Paz County. But then you add the factor of a foreign company that's here, not only in a basin, leasing from State Land Department at a discounted rate. And might I add that because of those discounted rates, La Paz County has beneficiaries that receive funding from the State Land Department off those leases. That's our kids' education. So not only are they taking water, but they're taking money away from our kids, away from our schools. When we have schools that have to combine classes because they can't pay teachers enough to get them here. So not only are they sucking the water, but they're taking that away from our children. And I think that that's just insane. And I can't believe that I don't understand why the state allowed this to happen in the first place.
Well, so you mentioned that you're not opposed to farming. Obviously, there is a lot of
Right.
agriculture
We
in
do.
in your community. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how, going forward, how do you envision balancing that? Because we know that agriculture uses the majority of the water that's used in this state. So given some of the issues that are present in La Paz County and the lack of regulation, how do you balance continuing agriculture, which is an important
Right.
industry there, but also making sure that you continue to have water?
Right. And it's been frustrating because I think that, and I can't speak for the farming community, but if I was on their side having to look at this, they're like, oh my gosh, here comes the big bad government, wanting to come in and regulate. And that's not the case. I think it would be nice to have both entities sit down at the same table and say, hey, look, you know what? We need to do something now to where we can protect what's under number one, we need to find out what's underneath there. Let's just start with that. And then number 2, what do we do moving forward to make sure that we're not continuing to issue well permits in these areas that are having problems? To me, that's just insane. I don't understand why that's happening, but also figure out a way that we can work together to either at least start metering. What regulation would the agricultural community be comfortable with? We have to start somewhere. And that's been part of the problem with even getting legislation or anything through is nobody, they just think, oh my gosh, you're going to come in and shut us off. We're not going to be able to use any more of our water. That's not the case. We need to, number 1, get data. Number 2, we need to figure out what works for everybody to where we can have a future in rural Arizona, because we deserve to have a future.
Are there conversations happening about potential other sources of water? Like Troy mentioned, the wastewater treatment plant. Maybe that wouldn't be the right solution, for example, in La
Right.
Paz County, but are there other sources that you can tap into?
We have our groundwater and we have the surface water, and right now everybody's targeting both.
Again, that's terrifying.
It's very terrifying. And it's something that, you know, we continue to go down to the legislature, you know, and now it's, you know, we're having to go to the governor because we just can't get anything passed. And if we don't do something, we're going to end up like Owens Valley.
So Kathy, another audience question. Audience member wanted to know how long groundwater supplies would last in the state if the Colorado River ran dry. Do we know the answer to that
I
question?
do not know the answer to that question, but you know, it would certainly, if the Colorado River dies as it is dying, the more groundwater will be pumped. And I can't quantify that for you. I just don't know the answer to that question, but it will certainly put more stress on our groundwater.
How has the state done in terms of, you know, Troy had mentioned that, you know, groundwater is sort of the resource of last resort. Have we done a good enough job statewide? I mean, maybe La Paz County we should exclude because, as Holly has indicated, we know the answer to that. But in other parts of the state, like, have we done a good enough job of sort of reserving groundwater for when we actually need it?
No. Simple answer, no. Listen, I've spent my entire career on groundwater, and I think that what we did in 1980 for the active management area was revolutionary. I keep using that word. Maybe that's dated by now, but we put a lot of really good things in place. And even though it's flawed, the Groundwater Management Act has pushed the envelope further out in terms of how we can survive. But there are, La Paz County is not the only place where this is going on. And I put the blame on it. I call it industrial ag, Holly. I think that's very different than the small farmer and the families that have lived there. This is big commercial industrial ag that has come into La Paz, that's in Wilcox. And Wilcox isn't from
In southeastern Arizona.
yeah, Wilcox Basin in southeastern Arizona. They're from Minnesota. And, you know, they're doing the very same thing there that's happening in La Paz. And the same thing was happening up in Mojave County. Why? Because there are no restrictions on bringing new land into cultivation and drilling new wells. And without those restrictions, people will continue to do it because they mine their, and now they have to find a new source.
Are there other states, like, do our neighboring states have more restrictions on groundwater, more regulation on groundwater than we do?
Some, so New Mexico for a long time has treated groundwater as more of an interconnected resource to surface water. The same with Idaho and Colorado. California is trying to bring its groundwater under control, but they're late to the game. And the laws are these long-term laws that go out to, you know, 40 years before the state can step in. So we don't know for sure. California has some of the same problems that we have.
I'm just trying to get a sense, and I think, you know, some of the audience members ahead of time submitted questions about, like, why is this such an issue here? And maybe it's happening in other states and we just don't hear about it, but it seems as though the example of, like, the Saudi firm in La Paz County, it seems to really happen here more than it happens elsewhere.
I think if you were reading the California papers like I have been over the last few years, you would know that the Central Valley has a lot of these same problems with big commercial pistachio farms and other kinds of nut farms, and a lot of small community wells drying up and the groundwater levels falling, and in fact, pushing some of those farmers out of California to Arizona.
Interesting. So Troy, we've talked a little bit about some of the other solutions that Phoenix is looking at. Can you, for example, treat enough wastewater to make up for potential losses on the Colorado River? I know Phoenix doesn't rely on the Colorado as much as other places, but I assume you also are fairly interested in not only preserving groundwater, but also preserving the salt and Verde rivers as well. So can you sort of, for lack of a better word, create new water, enough of it to keep those other resources sort of where they're at?
Yeah, so to put it in perspective, I think we were looking at about 60 million gallons a day of wastewater conversion. And that's, for multiple cities. To kind of put that in perspective, our Colorado River supplies that go to the taps now are on average about 125 million gallons a day. So about half of is kind of what we're talking about. As you bring additional resources, and then that would kind of increase, but not to that level. And so I think the other piece that we're working on with other valley cities is increasing Bartlett Dam possibly. And so increasing the supplies that come out of the Salt and Verde. You see now, every 20 or 30 years or so, you get the Salt River running, right? We see that in the past couple of months or so, the Salt River project's releasing water down because we're at capacity. Both the Salt and the Verde side are full. And it has that ability to do that more often if we can catch it. I think one of the analysis that we have of looking at climate change and how that's affecting our surface water supplies is you're going to get longer periods of dry and longer periods of wet. And we need to be able to capture the wets to help mitigate what happens in the dries. And what we've seen over the past 20 years or so is dries. I think the last wet period that I want to say on the Salt and Verde River system was probably 2007-10 kind of time frame that we saw this sort of thing where we had releases, but it happens cyclical. And if we can catch that, that'll help prolong those. I think the Salt River Project and the cities are doing a better job to manage their surface water supplies, to make sure that they're renewable and we can still use those as we move forward. But at the end of the day, we're not necessarily creating any new water, right? It's the same amount of water that the planet's had. It's just where it's at, right? It's just, if you go back to your 4th grade class, it's this water cycle. It's just going in a circle. So it's, can you catch it? Can you treat it? And can you put it to use before it goes back into the cycle?
Well, putting it to use seems to be the key phrase here, right? Like, yes, there's sort of the same amount of water, but where is it? How can we use it? And is it drinkable? Is it suitable for agriculture? Is it suitable for whatever use you have for manufacturing, that kind of development, that kind of thing? Is Phoenix confident that it can continue to grow the way that it has with the water that you have available to you?
So there's a couple of things with that. What we've seen over the past 30 years is somewhat of a decoupling of water usage to growth. And what we mean when we say those things are, we produce the same amount of water today as that we did in 1990, even though we've added population. And so what we see is the populations that we do have are becoming more efficient, better use of their water. And I think as we go forward, that needs to evolve even further, as most of our water is used outside, right? And so we need to be conscious about the types of plants that we're planting. We need to be conscious about how we're watering and making sure that we're not overwatering the desert landscaping that we do have. We've seen naturally in Phoenix the removal of turf. Organically, where you see big news articles with Las Vegas and all of this, look at our turf removal. Phoenix is on the same pace of turf removal that Vegas is, even though they're investing huge amounts of dollars to achieve that. I think our residents kind of understand that and are adapting. You also see things in the city of Phoenix that's going to happen here in the next month or so of asking new development to do more. Asking new development that when they come and they're developing, that we're having more unlandscaped open space. And what I mean by unlandscaped, just natural. Whatever's there and it grows off of whatever rain that we have, you have more of that. Making sure that we don't necessarily have lawns out in the front where nobody's using, or we're thinking about how we're doing it, making sure that we're putting water sense appliances inside the house, to making sure that the water efficiency that we have, making sure that the water efficiency of the controllers that we have for outside water use are looking and adapting to rain that's happening, so that they're shutting off automatically. All of those things that are happening, I think what you're going to see is from the cities is those become ordinances. If that's how we grow smarter. And we're putting those thoughts in and we're doing it.
Holly, how are residents in La Paz County, like what kinds of things sort of along the lines of what Troy is talking about, Are residents there, obviously water's a big consideration there.
Mhm.
Are residents sort of doing the same kinds of things in your communities?
Yeah, you pretty much don't see any grass anywhere. They've resulted in going to more of, drought tolerant plants and stuff like that. And that seems to be kind of the culture out there, as it is for our whole entire area. You see that a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is grass, but there for a period of time, even our high school went without any water, and they were literally having to play on dirt, until Representative Cobbett stepped in and and investigated that, trying to figure out why this is happening. And of course, the local water company at the time was having issues with with the water and stuff. So it's green now, but I mean, I'm just saying, but we've gone through those, some of those hard times, but you don't see a whole lot of grass in the rural areas, in La Paz County.
Are there conversations in La Paz County about maybe different land uses? Obviously, as we've talked about, agriculture is a big part of the lifestyle there, but are there conversations about maybe using that land in different ways that maybe uses less water?
Well, if it's owned, you can't really tell a property owner what they're going to do with their property.
Sure.
We really don't have any control over that. So, again, it goes back to the fact that we have, basins that are unrestricted. People know it. You have companies coming in and purchasing property. They know that there's a natural resource under the ground. When you're buying 9,000 acres for $47.5 million, obviously they're buying it for a reason.
Kathy, we have a question from the audience wondering why is it so difficult to replenish aquifers?
Well, it can be done. And in fact, it is being done a lot, especially in the active management areas. There's a lot of replenishment artificial recharge projects that have been built and are being used in the active management areas. And there's a lot of water then that is stored underground from these efforts. But that too is expensive. You've got to have the source of water, such as CAP water, which is now very scarce, or treated wastewater. And then you have to have the land area, and then you have to have it near where it could be pumped again. And that's part of the problem. We haven't done a good job of that. We've done a good job of getting the water underground, but we haven't always put it where we can access it. And so now when we need it, there's a huge effort underway to try to figure out how we're going to pump it out and where. So there's a lot of moving parts to it. We've done a good job of it. It can be done, but you only put water underground, really recharge water, that you don't need to use directly. And if you need to use it directly, it's not there to put underground.
You sort of see the aquifers as like a bank, as it were.
Right.
Another audience member wanted to know if there were objections back in 1980 when the Groundwater Management Act was being drafted and debated in the legislature. Were there objections from rural communities to being included in active management areas?
Oh yeah. I went around the state with the Groundwater Management Study Commission, and we had hearings all over the state. And Wilcox, I said, get out of here. We don't want to even see you. They were not interested in management. And up north in that area, they weren't interested either. So a lot of people are fearful of what it means to manage groundwater. And I think unreasonably fearful. So there was a lot of opposition. And there was a lot of opposition even in some of the AMAs, but we did it anyway.
It's interesting, Holly, that there was so much opposition from some of the rural areas, and it's like kind of come 180 degrees over the last 40 years or so.
Yeah, it really has. And with La Paz County being the last one that was formed in the state, Groundwater Act was created in 1980, of course. You know, we weren't La Paz County at the time. We were considered Northern Yuma County at the time. So, you know, wonder what their what their position was at the time when the 1980 Groundwater Act was being discussed and whatnot. Because, you know, the CAP runs right through La Paz County. So you kind of wonder, on the timeline, you know, I'll hear were created right, you know, shortly after the Groundwater Act was passed.
Right. Kathy, do you think it's possible that we mentioned the communities in Cochise County that created their own AMAs? Do you see that happening in other parts of the state? I mean, Holly doesn't think it's necessarily a realistic option in La Paz, but do you think it could potentially happen elsewhere, that more of the state could choose to put itself into an AMA?
Yes, and I think in large part because the legislature refuses to do anything. So as we keep getting further and further down the road, people are frustrated and they say, well, even if we don't particularly like the idea of an AMA, we've got to stop the hemorrhaging. We've got to do something. So I think it's entirely possible that we will see other areas on their own try to create an AMA or ask the department to create an irrigation non-expansion area.
So, okay, so this is the second time that phrase has been mentioned. Holly mentioned earlier. What is that?
So that is just what it sounds like. It is an area, a groundwater basin, where you can't expand irrigated agriculture beyond what was being irrigated in the 5 years prior to the designation of the irrigation non-expansion area. So it's a freezing of agriculture.
So it's what's been happening can continue to happen, but no more. Holly, it sounds like maybe that is a more realistic option for you.
Yes, it would, but you have to have the data first, you know, in order to, you need to come up with the data with hydrology studies in order to prove your case for that, you know, because ultimately, as Kathy already knows this, the decision comes from ADWR, you know, on whether or not that can, you know, that can be approved or not. So, you know, I would love to be able to do something in our county. And the reason I don't think AMAs would work for us, I don't think you could get 100-year water assurance, you know, in La Paz County if we were to get that designation. However, the INA would serve a better purpose because at least we could stop some of the bleeding right now. You know, if I could get ADWR to just stop issuing permits, that would be fabulous. But, you know, I was told he doesn't have the power to do so. You know, he can issue them, but he can't say no. And to me, that's another thing I don't understand, that, you know, in an area that's got land subsidence and we're having nothing but water issues, why do you keep, you know, here you go, let's just keep passing them out, you know, as they go along. But getting back to your you know, what you stated, yeah, the INA, I do believe, but it comes down to getting data first. We have to have that to state our case.
Kathy, go ahead.
Just to say, I'm so familiar with the Groundwater Management Act, and unfortunately, the director does not have the authority to deny well drilling permits.
Why not?
Because he doesn't have the statutory ability. The way the law reads is the director must do certain things, but if he doesn't say he can do them, then he can't do them. So and in fact, it says for permits outside of active management areas, the director shall issue the permit if certain statutory requirements are met. And there are things like name and address, where you know, who the company is. I mean, they're just a list of things. And then the director shall issue the permit.
I mean, if it's in statute, in theory, that would be changeable, yes?
Absolutely.
Why hasn't it been?
Because of the legislature. Because this legislature for the last 10 years, 8 to 10 years, just doesn't want to deal with this issue. There are legislators who do. Many of them who do. There have been great bills introduced, as Holly said, but most of them won't even get a hearing. They won't even bring them up in committee.
Right.
So given that we've seen a community put itself into an AMA that wasn't already, And given what Holly has said about basically all but pleading to have some kind of regulation on groundwater, none of us are in the legislature. I don't know if there are any legislators in the room, but none of us up here are in the legislature. So I'm not going to ask anybody to get inside anybody's head, but like, water is clearly an issue that lawmakers have dealt with in recent years. We saw the drought contingency plan. We've seen other pieces of legislation passed. Why the reluctance to deal with this?
Oh, you know, you would think that with the polls, for example, that have just been released and all that show that the public want to have all these things done, that the legislature would go, gosh, yeah, let's do it. They aren't listening to the people who respond to those polls. They are listening to lobbyists who represent special interests. And for whatever reason, those lobbyists don't see that it's in their special interests to pass these bills.
So Holly, do you have any, I don't want to be all doom and gloom here, but like, do you have any measure of optimism that the situation in La Paz County will get better?
You know, you just never know. We have a change of administration now. With the previous administration, it was extremely frustrating. It just fell on deaf ears. You know, no matter how many letters I wrote, no matter how many petitions I submitted, how many times I went down to try to plead with representatives outside of La Paz County to try to lobby them myself, you know, to say, hey, look, this is what we're needing from you. Can we get your support, you know, on what we're trying to do here? So it has been very frustrating. Now that we have a change in administration, we have an AG that's been so far just a shotgun right out the door, you know, and for her to be able to step up and at least back up what she ran on, you know, as a politician, because you don't always see that. You know, they'll say one thing and get into office and, you know, next thing you know, they have their own agendas or get their own agendas at the time. But she stepped up and has really gone to bat for La Paz County. She took the time to come out and take a look at what I was talking about, come and meet with people. And now we're seeing some action. It may only be 2 wells, but my gosh, that's more than anything's been done since the time I've been in office. And the fact that she's looking at the foreign companies that are, you know, leasing state land. And like, I keep going back to the legislature, there was a bill that went through the House that would have stopped this from happening, only to fail in the Senate. And it's like, what are we doing? You know, why, I don't understand why our Arizona representatives would not at least stop the foreign companies from taking our natural resource away from this country and in Arizona. So, you know, there is hope with Chris. I do, and I'm, you know, and I have not had a chance to get with Governor Hobbs, but, you know, I know I'm part of a working group that we're trying to get in front of her, hopefully in the next week or two, to plead our case for rural Arizona.
Do you get the sense that there are other wells or other leases or other operations that the Attorney General could, if not revoke the permits like she did with these two, could take some kind of action on? Like, has there been any conversation about any of that?
You know, we've specifically talked about the Saudi-owned company, you know, and stuff, and I'm not going to get ahead of the Attorney General, you know, on that particular thing, but I know that the practices, I believe I can say this on behalf of her office, she doesn't agree with the practices of those, but as far as getting into each one and what they consist of, you know, I'll leave that up to her department, but you know, I know that it's a glimmer of hope, and very thankful that she's at least taken the stand and stood up for a little county on western Arizona. So it's refreshing.
Kathy, do you get the sense that lawmakers understand the issue of groundwater? I mean, it's, as we've discussed, it's complicated. Like, there's a lot to try to learn about it. Do the people who are making the policy in the state, I don't mean to be rude about it, but like, do they know what they're doing on this issue?
You're asking the wrong person. You know, I think they understand more than they used to, because there's just been a drum roll of media and talk and, people and if they don't, then they're not paying attention at all. But do they really understand the nuances of it? I've watched a few bills that have been debated and it makes me think, oh, no, I don't think so.
Troy, when you look at what lawmakers do and what the state in general does, obviously a lot of it is in reference to rural Arizona, places outside the AMAs, but what kinds of things do you look for and listen for that could potentially impact the city of Phoenix in all these conversations?
So a lot of it is just making sure that the rules that we have that protect us and protect the groundwater that we have stay in place. And a lot of what we do during legislative sessions is play defense. That's making sure that we're not losing that buffer or that control that is there to make sure that the rules stay the same.
So I'm curious, Kathy, based on what you said about other communities potentially putting themselves into AMAs, like if the legislature is not willing to do it, is this the kind of issue? Obviously, voters, as you referenced, care a lot about water. There are polls that suggest that Arizonans recognize we need to do something. Is this the kind of thing that voters could take to the ballot and do for themselves?
Yes, to a certain extent. And there is talk about doing that. There has been a lot of talk over the last year about running an initiative on certain things. Now, we all know that's pretty tough and groundwater is pretty technical. And so running such a technical initiative might be difficult. But let me also say that the director of the Department of Water Resources currently has the authority on his own to designate a new irrigation non-expansion area or a new AMA if certain requirements, statutory requirements, are met. And I don't know whether they exist in La Paz County, but they might. And the question is there a way to get a hydrological study done that allows that process to proceed forward? So I think we may see under the Hobbs administration more initiative on the part of the Department of Water Resources to take a new look at some of these areas and do that without having to get legislative approval.
Holly, have there been conversations about trying to get that designation for La Paz County?
Again, it goes back to getting a hydrology study done first. And my first letter to the director of ADWR, the current one, I wrote a letter back in 2015 requesting that. And it still hasn't been done. So, like I said, it's been extremely frustrating. Everybody knows there's a problem, and it's just trying to get, help from the legislature and the state to try to help out La Paz County. We're just a little county. We're not a rich county. We run off of property that's 6% privately owned land. That's almost impossible to survive on, let alone pay for a hydrology study, and stuff within our budget. So, you have to look to the legislature, to the governor to appropriate funds, to help us with these hydrology studies and stuff. We just had a visit 2 weeks ago from Congressman Gallego. I had this conversation with him, and he's, is looking at that. Hey, maybe we can try to help La Paz out. We just want studies done. That's it,
Is cost,
I don't think that's asking a whole lot.
is cost the main impediment to getting it done?
So it runs about there was one that was done for the Wallapai Basin, for Mojave County. It was done through legislation. There was a allocated amount in the amount of $100,000 paid to World New Matrix is the one that did the water model for Mojave County. La Paz was originally part of that legislation, but I believe they couldn't do both. I'm not sure what the makeup was at the time, in appropriations. I know there's a lot of money there now. So, something needs to be done in order to be able to get these studies done for us so we can move forward and try to do some sort of protection on these basins.
Yeah, the state's sitting on a pretty big surplus right now. You think a couple $100,000 in a $10 billion budget is not a
You,
What's the line?
I
for
don't
you?
want to say a drop in the bucket
A
because
couple, a million here, a million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money, right?
Yeah, it's for our little county, it is. It really, for us, it is. We're dealing with a lot of other issues that, the way counties are ran, a lot of times counties get stuff dumped on by the state. Responsibilities get turned over to the counties to deal with without funding. That has to come from our budgets, which takes away from other things that we would, like hydrology studies that maybe we could afford to do, spend $100,000 on one or something. And this was done back in 2018. So, I'm sure that cost has gone up since then. So, for our little county, that's a lot of money, specifically when we rely heavily on property taxes and special revenues and just trying to be creative on just keeping our county afloat, being able to survive, because I question every day how we were created with that small amount of property, real property to generate taxes. It just baffles the mind.
Kathy, I want to sort of go back to something that you had said very early on about how a lot of the studies that are done now they're obviously the technology is much better than it was in 1980. The details, get more detail, you really get a better sense. So I assume that with better technology maybe comes maybe a higher cost to do some of these hydrology studies. But even to do it now, how much confidence would you have in the results of that hydrology study to really know what the situation is, especially under the ground?
Well, I think in some of these basins, the problem's so bad that you'd have a lot of confidence. In other words, it's going to show, Wilcox is an example, it's going to show that the recharge is minimal and that the amount of pumping that's going on is huge, and that even if you're off by a little bit, you can't be that far off. So, and really part of the problem is that the department also has not always had the funds itself to be able to do a lot of these modeling studies. And so they've had to pick and choose what they're going to do first. And so, it is really important to do those studies because it's pretty hard to move forward without it. And I sympathize with Holly's concern, and I wish the legislature would give them some money so that this could happen.
Troy, you mentioned that the city of Phoenix is using less water now than it was a couple decades ago, despite the growth. What is your level of confidence that that can continue?
Yeah, our projections are that's going to continue. Most of that's happening in the southern part as you're getting fixtures changed out, as the landscaping is getting changed out. And then if you couple that with smart growth and doing it wisely as they're adding that, yeah, we think that's going to continue here for a while.
To make that happen, how important is it for things like reclaimed wastewater, other sort of quote unquote new sources? I know you don't like that phrase, but like how important is it to do those things to make that happen?
So what that's going to do is help control the demand piece, and then that would then allow to add the supply piece, to add more buffers and add more security that we have the supplies to meet the demands, right? So if your demands aren't growing wildly, it's a lot easier then to build the supply side to manage that. And so we're hoping to do both at the same time.
It's an interesting dichotomy, the two of you sitting next to each other, Troy and Holly, because Troy, you're talking about creating additional buffers, and Holly, you're talking about like
Survival.
trying to survive, right? Like it's just such a visceral dichotomy with the two of you in different parts of the state. And as Kathy mentioned, Wilcox down in Cochise County is a similar kind of a situation. I suspect a number of rural areas are kind of in the same position that you are, Holly.
Yeah, it's sad. And we have the other factor too, which is our surface water. So, not just do we have the groundwater, but we have entities coming after that surface water too, to pump it down here, have it come down the CAP. So, both of our resources are being targeted right now.
All right, so I want to wrap up. We're just about out of time. I want to wrap up and just sort of go down the line. We've kind of touched on this question, but I want to ask each of you specifically about the future of the state, given not just the groundwater supplies, but sort of the entirety of the water available to us. And Kathy, why don't I start with you? Do you think that the kind of growth that this state has had over the last several decades and that is projected to continue well into the future, is that sustainable given our current situation?
Boy, I've given a lot of thought to this question, and I always talk about it in terms of the God of growth, and that's really what it is about in Arizona. I feel like we're always looking to feed the God of growth, and growth happens because why? Because Arizona's beautiful, and because people want to live here, and because we built a community and a society that's worthwhile. And so part of me says, yeah, I think we'll hang on, but it's going to be different than it is now. And how will I want to continue to be here? I don't know. I ask myself that question a lot because I see changes happening that I've lived here for 45 years. I see changes happening that I'm not pleased with. And I think that we have to really start to look holistically, to balance what we're doing, to figure out what's most important to us as a state and how we're going to prioritize our water supplies and our needs. And we don't, as a state, have a strategy. We don't have a vision for what we should have. And I think without that, it'll just continue to be sort of this and that. It'll grow. Phoenix is going to grow. Phoenix will definitely grow. This valley will grow. Will we like it? Don't know.
So Troy, your focus is obviously on the city of Phoenix, and as Kathy indicated, seems pretty likely Phoenix is going to continue to grow, by far the biggest city in the state. But I'm curious, like, if you can take sort of a step back and look at even valley-wide or from a statewide perspective, is what we're doing, can it continue?
I think as Kathy said, it'll be different. I am optimistic that we figure out this water supply issue. I think what you've seen historically is that Arizona has been resourceful enough to sort that out. That is a lot of weight for the state to carry, but historically they have. And it may be, Pollyannish or something to think that we can sort this out, but I think we can. I think some of the challenge is the rate in which this water thing is happening is faster than I thought, right? When we sat back and we looked, and the city of Phoenix started with the drought infrastructure, it started as a concept in 2015, and the thought was, I don't know, 2030 or something, we may need this, but yet it's online and we'll be testing, and maybe next year, maybe the year after that. It's going at a faster pace than I would expect it, and so I'm hopeful that everybody understands that and makes the appropriate decisions to be able to react quick enough. The problem is, as everybody stated, is if they don't, then there's going to get bumpy as we move forward. But I think once you get to that area, then they have no choice but to make decisions and to make those things happen.
Holly, speed seems to really be like time is really of the essence in your community as well. What do you think about the future of growth in this state?
I don't know what to say at this point. I've been fighting, it's like a David and Goliath type situation, where you keep trying to climb, trying to get at the big issue, and it's very difficult when you're the little person down here, and that's how I believe the rural communities all feel, that it's us against metropolitan areas down here. And how are we going to protect our water, for our own growth, which we all have a right to do. And I do sympathize with the fact that, the metropolitan areas do have issues, they are structured under those AMAs. They do have the restrictions, but, we need to figure out a balance for this, because we can't all just be the sacrificial lamb so that everybody down here can grow. We need to figure that out, in targeting the areas that are unrestricted, even though that was kind of the the talk back in the 80s, because I know La Paz County, for one, had the label of water farms, you know, right after we were formed. So, you know, you have maps even showing that we were going to be their future use. And you know, and I kind of laughed about it at the time till I saw newspaper articles, and now we're in real time. We're seeing it now in real time. What they were talking about then, we're seeing it now. And we're not just seeing it in La Paz, it's throughout the rural communities as well. You know, and we want to protect what we have, you know, for the people that I represent, you know, and that's why I continue to fight for them.
All right, that'll have to be the last word. Thanks again to our panelists, Holly Irwin, Troy Hayes, and Kathy Ferris. Thanks to everyone who took part in tonight's conversation, either here in person or online. Thank you also to the Walton Family Foundation for their support in making this discussion possible. Note that the KJZZ Water Series Every Last Drop continues in a couple of weeks with a 3-part in-depth series on the quality of the water we have. We'll be looking at contaminants and safety, so be sure to listen for those conversations, those stories on KJZZ 91.5. Also, you can find all of our coverage on water at water.kjzz.org. We'll also be posting video of this conversation online as well, so if you missed any of it or just thought it was so great you want to watch it again, that'll be up online as well. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching online. Have a good night. Thank you for being here.